Hello and welcome to this video. We'll be presenting an issue to you guys with DBD or Unreal Engine and frame time issues when you leave the game running on the default FPS cap. So as we all know, DBD has an in-game FPS limit now of a preset of 120, 90, 60, 59 and 30. And I want to look closer on how these FPS caps limit or affect the game's frame time and general responsiveness and feel. Starting off, we're gonna leave the FPS on 120 and we're gonna boot up into a custom game and have a look at the FPS. So we're in game now, and in the top left you will see MSI Afterburner, which is a benchmark tool, together with Riva Tuner Statistics Server, which just helps bring some extra monitoring tools. So I think it's worth noting that our current FPS is indeed 120 as we set the in-game FPS cap. But there is one value that is particularly interesting, and that is the 1% lows, which the 1% lows is the lowest percentile of frames. Basically is what you'll notice if the game starts to lag. It is the 1% lowest that is most telling. And currently this is the game running at stock. You'll see set the cap in game at 120, but I'm still getting frame rates lower than 120 even on a good computer. My current setup is a 4090 and a 14900KS Intel processor, which should realistically be more than capable of hitting 120 FPS even in the one low percentile. So the point of this video is to show what happens if you don't let DBD cap your FPS and the effects that will have on the frame time, the overall FPS of your game. So before I cap the FPS, just remember the numbers 1% lows, but also look at the FPS max, which is telling that we're even overshooting the FPS cap at times, which could be one of the reasons why we are getting frame rates below 120. If the game overshoots, then maybe it has to compensate and pauses rendering for the game. So I'm going to be doing this with a Riva Tuner Statistics Server, which is the same tool as I'm using to monitor this. So I have a frame rate limit here set to 120, which is basically identical to the in-game's FPS cap. But once I enable this, you will notice a difference in both the FPS max, but most importantly, the 1% lows. So I enable the FPS cap now with keybind. I'm going to reset the benchmark. And we can see now that when I enable this FPS cap, and I didn't let DBD control my frame rate, suddenly my 1% lows is what I would expect it to be in this system, which is 120 FPS. And additionally, you will see the frame time graph. It's not super visible, but now it looks a lot more smooth compared to when I didn't set the FPS cap from a third-party application. Just to compare, I can quickly disable it now. If you look top left, I disable it now, and you will see the graph is a lot more noisy. It's not a stable straight line, which you would expect, because it should be able to uphold a average frame rate of 120 and with minimal dips to anything below that. And I think it's important to note that this is not only an issue with 120 FPS. This is specifically, from what I've tested, specifically for when DBD is trying to cap your FPS, when in reality you can go above the in-game's FPS cap, but it's capping your FPS and giving inconsistent frame time. So I'm going to go into game again and set the in-game FPS cap to 90, and we'll have a look again what happens when DBD is trying to limit my FPS to 90. And again, we'll look at the 1% lows and the maximum FPS, which is the highest FPS that I'm getting. All right, so I'm gonna set the FPS cap now to 90. I'm gonna reset the benchmark. And again, this is without an external FPS cap. This is DBD alone, trying to limit my FPS. And we can see that the 1% lows is 80 frames, which again is below what I would expect from DBD when it's asking me to limit the FPS to 90. You can obviously see the graph is noisy as well. It's not a super straight line, and you can also see the very tiny number, which is the frame time, which is basically the time elapsed between consecutive frames. And the frame time with 90 seconds should be 11.1 milliseconds, which we are not consistently achieving. However, if I go back on the RivaTuner statistics server to enable an FPS cap to, this time I'll set it to 90. It's currently disabled. But if I hit the button to enable the FPS cap, you can see now that the frame time is exactly 11.1 millisecond. And if I reset the benchmark, see the 1% lows is indeed 90, which is what I expect when I set the FPS cap to 90 in-game. So we see that this works both for 120 FPS and 90 FPS. I would assume it also works for FPS lower than that. But the point of this video is not to benchmark every single FPS cap and check out every single scenario. But it is an interesting observation to see that it is the case for both 120 FPS and 90 FPS. When the game caps your FPS, it struggles to maintain the FPS. Now, the point of this video isn't really to tell you what much of an impact this is going to have on your gameplay, but it is interesting to note that the current way that the game limits FPS is not optimal. Now, I want to go ahead and showcase that it's not a hardware limitation, it is actually the game, as you can go into the game files and customize them to bypass the in-game's frame limit. And in this case, I'm going to put it to a limit of 240 FPS, which means that the hard cap of 120 FPS that we put in game earlier is going to be bypassed, and you can set the frame rate to a higher value. It is important to note though that this is not a recommended change, because this will in a lot of cases break the game's physics engine, because it's expecting a fixed frame rate of 240, and if you're not able to reach this FPS constantly, you're gonna have moments where your game is running slower than it should be. And the effects of this can be your character moving slower, and also other glitches such as teleporting around, which is not ideal. But we're gonna set this cap, put it to read only, then we'll go back into the game. Now, together with this change, I'm gonna set the RivaTuner statistics server frame rate limiter to match the new FPS cap of 240. Just like before, we're matching the FPS cap with the in-game's FPS cap. So we set it to 240, and we'll try load into a game again. Now this is going to be significantly harder to maintain these FPS limits, especially in my case, a game running on 240 Hz in 4K is not easy for a lot of hardware, especially on a 4K resolution. This is just a way of presenting this issue, showing that even with an FPS cap of 120, and I'm not hitting 120 on the FPS, when the 1% lows is dipping below 110. So enabling the benchmark, we see that the current FPS is 240, which is what we expect with the new FPS cap we set, and the average 240, so it shows that my hardware is able to run the game at this frame rate. However, we don't have the current FPS limit set up, so it's running on the engine's FPS cap that we set on 240. with a 1% lows with around 176, 180. Once again, we can see the frame time curve is jittery and super inconsistent. But now let's see what happens when we enable the FPS cap from River Tuner. We'll enable it now and reset the benchmark. And suddenly the 1% lows is much closer to the FPS that we are expecting from the game. So yes, even though it's not able to perfectly withstand a 1% low of 240, it still shows that there is some limitations to the game's engine and how it caps the FPS. Additionally, we see that the frame time should be around 4.1, 4.2 milliseconds. And when we're in game, we see that that is the case with the external FPS limiter. Once again, if I disable this limiter and rely on the game engine's limiter, we see that once again it's jumping all over the place, leaving a pretty inconsistent frame time. Now, I haven't played around too much with 240 FPS. I know some people do it and they report minimal issues with it, only against certain killers such as the Doctor can heavily impact, especially the 1% lows, causing major gameplay issues such as slow movement. And it would be interesting to see someone who's used to play at this frame rate try to enable this FPS cap and report back if they notice any improvements or any changes in how the game responds. So yeah, that was basically it for the video. I don't think this issue is limited to NVIDIA graphics cards. However, I have not tried any other graphics cards from the AMD series, but my assumption is that it's going to be a similar issue. Now, to get this FPS limiter, I haven't really played around much trying different third-party applications to do that, but I have tested River Tuner Statistics Server with MSI Afterburner, and it seems to fix the issue like we saw in the video, but also limiting the FPS directly in the NVIDIA control panel seems to work just as well. In that case, I would also assume that AMD has something equivalent in the drivers where you can limit an app to a specific frame rate, and I would heavily suggest doing so if you do care, and see for yourself if it causes any changes. Yeah, that's about it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and take care.